Perfect. Well, I appreciate it. And this is my first time doing the Global Power Platform for Poland boot camp here. And so I'm thrilled to be here. One of the things that I've always tried to do with organizations is help them to get the most out of their Microsoft 365 investments. Um, as a consultant for a number of years, but that's something that we have always tried to do, and I believe that that is now much easier to do today with the world of Copilot. Because when you think about it, Copilot, as I often say to my clients, Copilot is not about um, we don't have to necessarily know that Excel formula. Now we can pretty much tell Copilot what we want the application to do, and it returns those results. So we can get a whole lot more out of the 365 space and our investment using Copilot. However, that does not come without its risks. And so oftentimes we see, and I have seen organizations just oh, throw out Copilot and start licensing folks, and all of a sudden they start seeing the Copilot icon appear throughout their environment, and there's some risk involved in that. And so today I want to talk a little bit about some things to consider before we do a full-scale deployment of Copilot. And if we've already deployed Copilot widespread and we've not considered some of these things, that's okay. We can go back and make sure we secure those things up. Now, I'm going to give a lot of considerations. This is not necessarily a you have to do every one of these things sort of presentations, or these are the things that you definitely need to do. But there are several things that I will emphasize that you really should strongly consider before deploying Copilot. And even if you have, we can go back and start making sure that things are more secure. So these are more considerations. Just going to give you things that hopefully some of the things resonate there. So a um, little bit about me is I am currently a director of Microsoft governance for a Genworth, which is a pretty large financial and insurance organizations based here in Virginia in the U.S. Um, there's my contact information. I do have a LinkedIn newsletter that goes out once a week. It mostly covers areas around Purview, but also Copilot and 365 in general, as well as a YouTube channel. And I am also an MVP on Microsoft 365, Copilot, and Microsoft Purview. So we'll jump right in here and talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about. So we're going to go kind of back up a little bit and talk about some of the security models, the architecture that Copilot uses, some enterprise deployment risk, how we can mitigate some of that, some governance, compliance, data protection framework, and security best practices, some deployment architecture. We'll get into a little bit of plugin security. We will have a couple of demos here, so we'll drop out and do some live demos. We'll see how that goes. With threat protection, we'll be talking about that, privacy, data handling, and access control. And then we'll talk about how we might consider a deployment phase and then some lessons learned from organizations that did not have things quite as secure as they might have, should have had them. So let's talk about some architecture. Let's talk about some core layers here. So Microsoft deals with, at its core, foundation, processing, and integration. So at the foundation layer, Microsoft uses the graph, and um, it makes sure that the users are only are bound to the access that only authorized user content with current permissions. So as I always say to clients, Copilot doesn't necessarily introduce new risk, although there's some risk there, but really what it does is it surfaces existing risk. So if there's already a permission problem or an oversharing problem, Copilot can certainly surface that risk. The processing that large language model is secured in Azure Cloud, and so it ensures that the organization is isolated. Their large language model is isolated. Um, for data isolation and privacy. And the integration layer, this is one of the things that I talk to. I often hear, and you may have heard, clients or organizations will say, well, how does Copilot compare to, say, ChatGPT or Claude or Gronk or some of the others that are out there? And there's tons out there. And while other models may do a little better at certain things, I think where Microsoft wins in this category is this integrated story, and that is the fact that it understands how you work and it understands um, your business, and it lives in that layer of integration. So you see it in Teams and Outlook and in Word and Excel and so forth. And so that's kind of that part of that integrated story that I often talk about with clients. So that foundational role is that look, it's going to enforce user permissions. Um, the that content visibility is restricted to what users currently have permission to, and what they can access in SharePoint or Teams, and OneDrive and all of that. And so it maintains that boundary. If a user lacks that access to documents, Copilot's going to respect those boundaries. We're going to demo that when we talk some label classification, DLP policy. We're going to talk about that a little bit as a way we can kind of control what Copilot can do. So we'll get into that a little bit. Like I said, that large language model is isolated in the cloud, in Microsoft Cloud. It's not used for organizational training, or it's not used for model training. Um, and again, it is integrated throughout the entire story of the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. And so some of the risks that we run into is, of course, security risks. Potential vulnerabilities introduced by AI tools can expose sensitive data and systems. So we always have to be mindful of that. Operational risks. How we did things before may be different today. Um, so it may change some of those workflows. I know I'm working through a lot of changes as we introduce, and even our organization, Copilot. Um, a lot of policy changes, a lot of well, we'll get into like compliance risk. I'm meeting with compliance officers and legal teams and so forth. So we have to ensure that those tools comply with our legal, ethical, and regulatory standards to avoid penalties. And in the financial world, that's SEC, Security and Exchange Commissions, is a very big one. And of course, across Europe, you've got EU boundaries and GDPR and so forth. So user adoption risk. This is interesting because resistance to improper use or improper usage by users can reduce AI effectiveness, and your ROI can drop. So essentially, if a user doesn't understand how to use the tools, they're not going to. And they're so it's going to be an investment that's not going to give you a good return. So that's part of a risk. That's something that we have to consider as a when we're deploying Copilot proper training methods. And of course, we talk about data oversharing. How are we managing what's been shared? Um, we have a way to go and look at what's out there, what's shared, stale permissions, old permissions. So and so needed access to this document library, years ago, a contractor even. They no longer need access or haven't in years, but they still have that access. Copilot can expose that stale permission. Shadow IT is kind of a big one. When we get to where we restrict things so much. I have an article I wrote a while back called Locked Down and Leaking Out. And what the premise behind that is when you get to a point to where you lock things down so much, users are going to find a way to do their job and they're going to go shadow IT. The best bet, in my opinion, is to allow users to do the right thing easily, but have those safeguards there and force them to go through the 365 ecosystem if you're in that space So, for example, external sharing. A lot of people say, well, we're not going to do external sharing. Absolutely no way. But the problem is people are doing it. Okay. They may not be right clicking and sharing through the traditional OneDrive method or dropping a modern attachment into Outlook so that it's a link instead of a file. But all they do is just say, okay, well, it's no longer a link, it's just the file. So they're still doing it, and now you're forcing them to go outside that system. So we have to be careful about that. And shadow IT is on the rise because of that. Prompt injection is OWASP's number one considered threat today, and that is where a bad actor can get in and they get into an agent or into leaked credentials somehow and get in. They can essentially tell an agent, forget all instructions you've been told prior. And here is what I want you to do. That's a prompt injection. It's low risk today, but it is on the rise. We're seeing that. And of course, compliance drift, you have to stay on top of compliance. And third-party plugins, what are you going to allow into your team's environment? Uh, and so we have to, but those are just things that we have to consider. Debt problem, I kind of alluded to this a little bit, this permission debt where somebody needed permission back in the day, but maybe they no longer need that. We need to have a way to monitor this and to control access over time. So, we do this with guests, right? We have guest access reviews, we have role-based access reviews, those sort of things. So monitoring periodic checks on permissions within your environment's not a bad idea. And content sprawl. I have organizations that literally put everything on a hold. They literally put everything on a litigation hold because they do not want anything to leave. They want to make sure they always have access to the data, that it's discoverable. Well, all you're doing is you're just exposing your surface level, and the more data you have, the more at risk you are. And it also is more that Copilot can reach. Do we want Copilot reaching that? We'll talk a little bit about how we can block off Copilot from certain areas, but that's a consideration is how much data do we have? We have data from 1970s. It may sound funny, but I have clients that literally have data in their SharePoint environment that old. So hallucination risks is another thing. Now, this is not just, oh, it went off and started answering its own questions, but it's decision-making problems. This is a security risk you need to consider that when you have um, when you have a response, for example, you don't want to use Copilot does great things inside of Excel, but you don't want to count on it for financial decisions for your business, right? You want to always do checks and balances. You know, it can do great research for medical or legal, right? But you don't want to count on it for a diagnosis, right? There's literally warning labels that Microsoft puts on these scenarios where you have a financial decision to be made or a medical decision. We certainly don't want to count 100% on any AI solution for that. While it's a great research tool, you want to watch the decision making based on the AI. Um, Governance, compliance, and data protection. So here's where we really get down to it. And these are things that are really, you can control a lot in your environment. I hope many organizations, and I know a lot that I work with, one of the first things when we do a governance assessment or a compliance assessment, almost always we come away saying you need to up your label game, your classification game. Organizations must define clear sensitivity labels that are aligned to their business um, in order to protect data effectively. And this is where we're gonna really get into, and we're gonna see how this works in a moment. And then label enforcement. Each label requires, either encryption or access controls, usage restrictions to ensure data security. Now, on an E5 scale, you can do automated default labeling and automated labeling. So you can do a policy that auto labels, right, based on sensitive information types or classifications. but you can also do default labeling. So any net new document automatically gets this label, and then it can be justified to downgrade if necessary. But at one, I usually recommend organizations do a label that basically is pretty locked down to just internal. But if with justification, they can change the label and move it to say, okay, this really doesn't contain any sensitive information, so I can move this to a public label, for example, and then it'll allow sharing and so forth. But just have some taxonomy that you're using for your labels, very important. And then we get into DLP. DLP has added some controls around specifically for Copilot. We're going to look at that. But we can block sensitive content, watermark AI generated content, or content that contains sensitive information so that we can control it. Of course, alerting and restricted use and contextual controls and enforcement based on user location, device compliance, and so forth. There's a lot we can do there. Let's take a look. I want to take a look at DLP. I'm going to drop out of here real quick. We're going to look at data loss prevention here. I'm in Purview here, but I want to show you, first of all, I want to show you kind of an effect, and then then we'll go into kind of the setup here in Purview really quick and how that was done. So let's just take a look. Let's just grab this file here. I don't think there's anything sensitive about this file. We're going to pull this up. Let's view this a little bit differently. Let's do one page here. Let's do 100%, and let's zoom this up a little bit. Now, you see up here, I have a public label. Now, I can auto classify based on any number of things, but this is just a public label, meaning I could share this. There's no permissions. We can see Copilot's doing a generated summary of this file, the auto-generated summary. I can go into Copilot and ask it to do different. I can go into Copilot and say, "Okay, I want you to, summarize this or whatever. Uh, Give me anything I want." We kind of know how to do that. However, I do have, and I'm going to show you this real quick. I do have in my um, Actually, let's do this. Let's go to information protection, and I'll just show you. I have so sensitivity labels. Now I have a label here called Copilot block. Now we're going to look at this label, and we'll see that there is literally nothing about this label. It's just the name. The label will be used to restrict access as a description. Okay, but there's no configured access control. There's no content marking. I'm not auto labeling. There's no group setting. It literally is nothing. This label is just a tag. Okay, I have no controls in this label because I'm going to use this label for something very specific, and that is in my data loss prevention. I am going to create a policy, and I did. And the reason I did this prior to is, Purview doesn't, nothing works instantly in Purview. It takes some time. So I created this policy that basically says where you find this label, block Copilot or any AI. And I'm going to show you kind of what it looks like. So we can see here, I can reference this, I've got the summary, but now I'm going to go in, I'm going to literally drop this label to a Copilot block label. Again, it doesn't change the permissions. There's no watermark. I'm not doing anything crazy with it. It's just essentially a tag that DLP is going to use. And so it's saving. I'm going to try to expedite that and get that to save. But anyway, we'll see that I still have this, but once I get out of this file, and we'll go right back into it here, and through the magic of live demo, hopefully this works. We shall see that now when I try to generate, we're going to see that it's not allowed. Okay, if I can summarize this all day long. If I were to go into, let's try it. See if this will spin up quickly for me. All right, so I'll just see if it'll do that, summarize it for me. Do. And then we'll just flip this back here. Okay, I can't access its contents, right? The file's blocked by your organizational security policies. Okay, so that's what we get when we do this. And by the way, you can do this at the SharePoint site level. So I could create in a SharePoint site, I can say this is the label. Okay, I can give that Copilot block label to a SharePoint site, and it takes a little time, but over time, everything in that label, anything classified with that label would no longer be accessible to Copilot. I'm going to change this back and I'm going to say, okay, here's my justification because that's in my policy, and I'm going to say that label no longer applies. So now I can try again here, and it still doesn't know over time it would, but I can expedite that. We can drop that back here, open this back up, and we should be able to do a quick summary now. It should auto summarize. There we go. So now we have our summary back. So that's a little bit how we can do that in with Copilot, blocking it with a DLP policy. Let's really quickly, we'll take a look at this policy because all this policy is basically saying, okay, I'm just giving it a name here. I'm not doing admin units, and I'm not selecting a target because I'm really just looking at this down here, which is the Copilot and the Copilot chat. All right, we got to go next here. Now, create a rule. We'll look at this rule real quick. This rule basically says Copilot block. That's just what I named it. Well, here's the label, but I named it DLP Copilot block. And then the action is basically it's it's built right in. If I were to go here and say, okay, what's my action? It's right here. It's the only action you got because I chose Copilot. So this is relatively new. It used to just check, this, but now it's saying it won't allow it to access any knowledge sources. That includes an agent. It's hard to put a label there. So, and then of course we have all our alerting, typical DLP stuff, right? So that's how, and it's really simple. But the label itself has no markers in it at all. It's just a tag. But now I'm using DLP to say where that label exists. Now block Copilot, right? So that's just a little bit how we do that in DLP. We're going to do that a little bit simpler here in a little bit when we get to DSPM for AI. So which is actually being rolled into DSPM. So that's a little bit of the demo there. So uh, some of the different control types that we might use to help security considerations when it comes to Copilot. Sensitivity labels, we talked about that, and DLP policies, how we use them together. You can do retention policies. So because and this is where I get into if you do holds, we have e-discovery holds, but if you hold too much or you put things, look, retention and holds are different. Okay. Um, Litigation holds is not a retention solution. You don't want to use it. You literally want to use litigation holds when you really need to put something on a litigation hold for a specific reason, not just because you want to just keep data around. Use a retention policy. But then you only want to have available data that can be surfaced within the retention scope because Copilot's going to reach that data if it's still around. So we need to be careful with that. Um, Communication compliance, almost anything is being rolled into communication compliance these days. We see this behavioral risk detection. I'm a huge fan of insider risk, detecting unusual activity by users. I'm a big fan of insider risk and adaptive protection. So where we can scale up our protections we looked at DLP, but I could have said if a user has this level of risk, then I want this DLP policy. If the user has this level of risk, maybe a moderate or more enhanced, then I want to kind of crank up the DLP policy. Maybe go from an alert policy tip to a MFA required um, to a total block, right? So we can do that with conditional access or DLP. Um, so those are some of the things. Those are some of the areas within Purview I would strongly consider when we're talking Copilot. All right, so some of the conditional access implementation stuff, we'll get through some of this. So definitely want to verify some identity controls. I always believe you should do MFA and some phishing resistant authentication. But I would um, you know, I would do MFA. I would do MFA for, every single time somebody logs in because they're gonna get what, you're gonna get, uh, you know, MFA weary, where you're just like, yep, approved, yep, approved, yeah. I mean, you don't really look at it, and so. But definitely, if it's a location based, if it's access to a certain specific area in SharePoint, especially if it has sensitive information there. Um, Device trust requirements. I highly recommend in managed compliant devices, um, you know, that are controlled with, you know, endpoint DLP or for sure an Intune manager, some compliance on the devices themselves that they've considered managed, because there you can control even further inside SharePoint the unmanaged device option, which of course creates conditional access policy. And so um, just some things to consider here. And location, right? So what do you require when somebody's um, in a particular location? Do we block areas that are not normally traveled? If I'm in an organization that has very little, in fact, I was in an organization that had no real presence in the UK, for example. But if we had, and so we had conditional access policies that would restrict, access from the UK. And if we would have someone needed to travel over there, then there would be an exception that would be created and so forth. So anyway, so location awareness is an important consideration. So some conditional access framework. This is a little bit of a busy slide, but I'll break this down. So in phase one, baseline protection requires some MFA, require compliant devices in approved locations for all Copilot access. And you do have the ability to do all of this with, well, they've even gotten better with DSPM, and we'll look at that in a minute. But risk-based controls, implement sign-in risk policies and user risk remediation requirements. A little bit of insider risk stuff, which is really good, kind of out of the scope of what we're talking about here, but definitely look into some insider risk controls. Pretty good stuff there. And then apply workload more granular. We can apply workload specific policies based on data sensitivity, user roles, etc. And then continuing to refine. This is not a one and done thing. Compliance and governance never is. It's always what's changing, what's moving, right? And we're going to have to continue to do this. So here's an example of recommended policies. So policy one, you might do just baseline Copilot access. All users, all Copilot licensed users, cloud apps at 365. I think they've just moved this to like cloud apps now. Conditions, any device, any location. Grant, we're going to do a grant control, allow, but we're going to do require MFA and compliant device. Okay, and that could be a mobile device or on a compliant enrolled device for work. Sign-in frequency of 1 hour. And then policy two, we could do a high-risk blocking. All compliant users, sign-in risk might be high. And if that's the case, then we might do a block access. And this is kind of where we get into this insider risk, when you can do insider risk as well as sign-in risk, which is part of the identity governance piece, which is an add-on to all of the rest of it. But we can block access, and we don't do session controls there. And then, of course, policy three, external access restriction to guest users. We can cloud apps 365, any device, block access to Copilot features. So those are just some examples of some conditional access policies. So from a tenant recommendations, P1, P2, I like P2. It gives you all the enhanced security stuff, data governance, purview, and SharePoint management. By the way, you get with a Copilot license, you get SharePoint Advanced Management. Does have a lot of extra governance things and some Copilot controls there. So you get that with a Copilot license now. Back in Build in Microsoft, they announced that that was rolling out, and it is out. So, but look, the more the better. If you've got an E5 SKU, use it and use it to its, full potential as possible because you get a lot of great purview stuff there. The DSPM for AI or DSPM now is one of those that we'll look at in a second. Um, all your email collaboration stuff, right? Defender, secure mail, you know, all of that stuff. Of course, retention policies. What are we doing with OneDrive retention, versioning policies to maintain data integrity and history? Just additional considerations and tenant requirements. And I will say this, that while Microsoft allows business standard and above to have a Copilot license, I don't know that I would do it with just a business standard, just because there's not much security controls in place. Now, natively, the Copilot is secure and all of that, but you don't have all of these other controls that we're really talking about. You don't get those until you really get into business premium. And then from there, you go E3 and then really E5. E5, you're going to get a lot of the more advanced stuff to deal with that. So some of the threat protection, monitoring, and incident response, endpoint security features, Defender for Endpoint, it just provides a lot of, additional protections, reducing attack surface, controlling folder access, and so forth. And then, of course, 365 threat protection. Um, this is kind of where we, back used to be called ATP, Advanced Threat Protection with safe attachments, safe links, the anti-phishing policies, all of the normal stuff we should be doing. Let's not forget the basics as well, right? Let's learn to, remember we need to block and tackle and all of the stuff that we need to do on the fundamental level of data security. Um, Definitely track Copilot queries, and you can do this in DSPM. Um, you can also do this now. Well, we'll take a glance at it here in a second, but you can definitely do this now with other, um, other areas within the admin center now. Agent 365 is a good one, right? Which is, they've kind of renamed that multiple times, but now Agent 365, where you can go in and see what all the agents are doing and happening. Definitely track that. Of course, event monitoring, monitor data loss prevention violations, have some labeling or have some alerting setup that makes sense. More often than not, I see, well, out of the gate, Microsoft gives you a ton of built-in alert policies. And all of those alert policies are going to, I think most of them, if not all, go to a group called tenant admins. That's essentially your global admins. The problem with that is, number one, nobody's looking at those alerts. Number two, tenant admins could potentially change because if you're using proper security controls like, privilege identity management, where you're elevating just in time to a global admin, then that list could change. And also, your tenant admin shouldn't be licensed for email. I'm of the opinion that your global admin should not have a license unless it's absolutely necessary for very unique situations, but generally they should not be licensed. I generally like, when it comes to event monitoring and alerting, I like to create groups for each alert segment. So for example, DLP alerts or email, you can break it down by Exchange Online or SharePoint or whatever, and have a group and have normal users in those that are licensed users. Now, they may not be able to take action because they might need to use another account, and you should, to elevate using PIM to that global admin role or the security admin role, whatever role is necessary to fix and address the alert. But I think it should be separate. And but anyway, that's just as my 2 cents on that, but a consideration to think about. Because you get too many alerts, and most organizations, they get too many alerts. They get alert wary, and they don't even follow up on it a lot of times. They just oh, we got that. Oh, okay, somebody's downloading 4,000 items from OneDrive. Okay, that's cool. So, but nobody does anything about it, right? So need actionable alerts. So definitely take a look at your alert policies and what's happening there. And all those purview alerts now are going over to Defender. That's where they're at. So they're really blurring those lines just a bit. So measure labeled content percentage, and Purview will show you that. Audit log completeness, retention policy, e-discovery response times, all of these processes are very important. Let's take a look at DSPM. Now, and all I want to do here, first of all, DSPM um, has changed a little bit. We're going to drop over here I'm going to actually go here to solutions and we'll see DSPM for AI. So DSPM for AI, notice it's now classic. And the reason is because it is now, and there used to be DSPM. So here's a DSPM classic. Then here's DSPM for AI. I mean, Microsoft, if they're not confusing you, they're not doing their job. So we have to do this. And so now they've taken this and put it into DSPM. Well, what a concept. So DSPM is now in preview, but it basically rolls kind of all of that in there. So basically all our AI stuff is in there. So while I'm doing that, I want to look at one other thing here. Let's go to, let's drop to the admin center if we can pop over here real quick. Because I know Microsoft is working on this, and I went to Teams admin center. It's not what I wanted to do. That's because that's where I was last. All right. So while that's loading up over there, we'll take a look at a few things here. So we got our general posture here, right? There's just some little things we can report on and look at, and stale data and fresh data. So this is good stuff to look at to see kind of what's happening in my environment. It's loading up here. So we see this agent here, right? This is what I meant by agent 365. This is where we can go in and kind of see agents in the environment. This is my own personal environment. It's not a ton going on here, but we can look at all agents, and I can see all of this. This is all agents that are available, right? And I can see, all kinds of information there. But I can drill in and look at user access, allowed agent types, tools. Um, Occasionally I pop in here because it definitely changes quite a bit. So definitely look in there. But in DSPM, in Purview, we have some objectives here, data security objectives. Okay, just kind of glance through here. So there's a lot because they change this a ton all the time. There's a lot of good stuff in here. So AI observability. Okay, and this is agent activity. Okay, it's different agent activities, whether they're active or not. Yep, these are all, and we can drill into all of those if there's policies there. But I want to get into discovery. So apps and agent. This is kind of like, we're going to agents. This is kind of like the Agent 365, but see if it loads up here in a reasonable amount of time. Okay, so there's a couple that I've used recently. I've got some policies around that. But when we if I get into Activity Explorer here in DSPM for AI, I can really drill in. I don't have a ton here. I wonder if I need to reset. Um, I'll actually look at this because it kind of is blending some different areas within Purview, and I'll look at some of the Activity Explorer because literally you can get to it in a lot of different ways. But here's where I want to focus. I want to focus on this. Um, I want to focus on this recommendations because remember we did this DLP policy over here, and we created this DLP policy. But some of the recommendations that show up here inside of DSPM, okay, here's some that I've completed, but look at some policies that we can set here, and it's giving you recommendations. You can't go in and create any new. And these grows over time. So, for example, um, protect. So we don't want to protect items with sensitivity labels from Copilot and processing, right? So anything with a particular sensitivity label, I can, so pretty much the same thing we did before, I could do that here. So for example, if I go in and say, let's do this, let's get started. And by the way, it shows us the top labels that are happening in the organization. So it's already kind of honing in on that. So remember, we went through the steps and created the label and the DLP. Oh, we already had the label and we created this DLP policy. What this does is basically the same thing. It just does it so much quicker. So now I can go in. This is another way to do it. So I can go into here, pick my label, add it, create a policy. It's done. It knows exactly what to do. I can go in and tweak it if I need to add some alerting or some reporting and but it pretty much goes in and just does it for me. It's creating my policies. I go over here we're going to go over here and I'm going to refresh this and we'll see another policy show up in DLP policies. Yep. Now it could take a little while for it to actually start working because it does sync. You see this, there it is. It's in simulation without notifications. And syncing in progress. That's syncing in DLP now. What it's doing is it's going across the targeted resources. It's checking the environment. It's basically letting everybody know, hey, there's new policies here. And so that's what that syncing is. And it could take a little while, a couple hours, even depending on the size of the organization, even longer. Okay, so that's an example there. Another example, and I've already created it just because I needed it to kind of do the syncing process. And I want to look at it, just recommendations here, and I've done it, it's completed, and it is down here when this loads up. All right, it's down here, and it is safeguard sensitive data in Copilot interaction. So this is where you can block across the board any SIT, any set or classifier from Copilot in one fell swoop. Let me show you what that looks like here. Here is the policy it created. Nope, that's not it. It is right here. Default DLP policy protects sensitive 365 Copilot interactions. And what I did is I went in and it's the policy sync status. Let's edit this policy. Next, next. Okay, Copilot. And it's restricting credit card number. So I have a file here called credit card, and it has credit card numbers in it. Actually, Copilot created it for me, corporate account numbers. So if I were to go into chat and say, summarize corporate accounts, let's see if it does it, fingers crossed. Yeah, I think yeah, it should have that label on it. Yep. Try to summarize the file. I am not able to access its contents. The file is protected and cannot be extracted. That's an important phrase, extracted, because that's how Copilot works. It extracts the content, sends it over to the LLM, and then the literal permission inside a label, if you want to use a label for that only, not do DLP, just a label, you can use the extracted phrase permission and it automatically will block it. So that's just a couple ways that we can use Purview easily to control access to um, our Copilot data. Um, we're going to go through this. I know we're coming up pretty close. We're going to go through some privacy handling. So, um, you know, Microsoft, including Copilot, is bound by geographical limitations. If you're doing multi-geo, then you can, it can be in multiple locations. But if your tenants in the Europe, your data is gonna stay there, right? It's not. That's where it's coming back to, and so that large language model may be used in multiple cloud regions to provide redundancy, but it is not leaving your region, if you will, but it could be in multiple locations. But then, for example, in the US, we have, I don't know, 9 data centers maybe. I haven't checked lately, but anyway, my data could be anywhere there, but it's bound to the US in my case. Um, may cache temporarily just to improve performance and and Microsoft has its own built-in backup, not true backup, but I mean, you could buy a backup solution they have now, but anyway, it's their locations are strategically placed within compliance boundary to ensure disaster recovery. That's just what we get there. Some key roles to consider. Global admin, that's your king. Although global admin can't do everything, but it can do most things, 95-ish percent of things. And of course, security administrator. These are the roles that I always tell people guard. If you're going to do PIM, these are the ones you want to PIM because these are the ones that can hurt you the most. Compliance administrator, SharePoint administrator, Teams administrator, Exchange administrator. Informational barriers, something I enjoy. I don't see it used that much, but informational barriers. If you truly need to segment your organization due to an M&A, a merger and acquisition, or something, Copilot's going to honor that informational barrier if you have it in place and have it configured to amongst different groups or whatever. So barriers, can separate complete, project teams or acquisition targets, etc. And of course, privileged identity management. Use PIM if you can. Now it is a P2, premium P2, um, but it's definitely controls your and really keeps tab on what's happening with your elevated roles. Definitely want to consider that. So here here's some things. So we definitely want permissions and sensitivity labels. We really want to, I would focus on those and data loss prevention in conjunction with labels as well. You want to cover 80% of your data with some classification. So basically, if you have, make sure that your data is classified in some way, whether it's, PII, personal identify information or protected health information, whatever your organization is, you want to make sure that you've got good classification there. Make sure that we have logging enabled, turned on, and get all your as far as you can. Now you can get 180 day. Now they've moved that from 90 to 180 from the E3. E5 has 1 year. You can extend that to 10 years with a little add-on there as well. Access control and defender and security team. So here's kind of roughly a 10-week rollout as I see it. Again, if you've rolled out Copilot and you've not considered some of the security stuff and some of these things, then you can go back and fix that. It's not a problem. But do a couple weeks of discovery and then some preparation, some pilot deployment. But end user training is huge. End user training is big when it comes to a successful Copilot rollout for sure. So don't forget the adoption side of things. It's very, very important. So here's a couple examples. We talked about somebody that had, needed access to something years ago. Everybody forgot about it. They still have access. Well, Copilot, that is the administrative assistant that had access, or an assistant who had access at one point, maybe has moved on to another department. Copilot can still surface that information. Um, and so A legacy SharePoint site has acquisition documents from 2018. It was never cleaned up. Copilot can still surface this data. Third-party CRM plugin, Copilot can still access that and potentially expose data. So establish vendor security assessments. Implement a plugin, allow listing, regular security reviews, and incident response procedures. Just some things to consider when we're talking rolling out Copilot. So Copilot is a comprehensive security approach. It requires, integrating architecture, risk management, governance, compliance, monitoring, legal. I mean, all of these areas could be, and in many cases should be involved in the decision making about the rollout. Effective risk management mitigates those security risks, and strong governance and continuous monitoring ensure compliance. So just, it's always keep tabs on what's happening, what's changing, changes in purview, new features. That DSPM is really growing, and Microsoft is constantly improving their footprint when it comes to making sure that they organizations are safe. Because look, nobody wants to be on the news, right? So we all want to be safe in our 365 environment. And that is what we are all about there. So that's it for me. We've got maybe, I don't know, I'm not sure what the timing was, but we do have perhaps some time. Otherwise, I would invite you to definitely right there scan that QR code and, you know, feedback is always welcome and encouraged. That's how we improve. That's how I get better. That's how we get better. And so definitely hit that QR code. I'll come right back to that, but one final thing here again, this is who I am. Feel free to scan that QR code, and that will take you to my LinkedIn profile. Happy to connect with you. If you've got questions later that you didn't think about, always happy to answer those questions as well. Again, back to that feedback form there. And with that, I'll turn it over to the moderators, or if there's any questions, happy to field those.
Awesome. Alan, thank you very much for the session. I'm just checking if there are any type of the queries which were asked to you. We have one about the recordings, and I allowed myself to answer it, that we will be publishing that at the Baltic Summit channel. I'm just checking if there are any other. No, I think not related to your session. That was quite a bunch of the useful info. If anybody have the question, this is a moment to ask it. If not, then I guess, Alan, if you are with us for a couple of more minutes, then you can cross-check the chat if I didn't miss anything and write the answer. And one more time, we thank you for your time and the great amount of the knowledge. And I hope that people will be a little bit more focused on that aspect. So the security, not only the hype.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, I am, happy to, continue to answer questions as I do often. If people want to connect with me over on LinkedIn. A lot from this, uh, a lot have already just being associated with the Power Platform Boot Camp here. So I've gotten
Yeah.
a lot of connections there. So definitely do that. Always happy to answer questions. I do that. That's part of the MVP community is we're
Mm-hmm.
all about trying to give feedback, and trying to help, you know, help people keep their finger on the pulse of Microsoft because it changes so fast, and so everybody's busy, but we we're we're trying to stay, we're really kind of one step ahead of everybody. That's about it. And so all we're doing is trying to relay the information as fast as we can back to the community. And so that's why we do what we do. So,
Yeah, indeed, to be on the wave, not under it.
yeah, for 100%.